Before her post at Northeastern, Niamh was a lecturer at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and she also worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Her first book, which was published by Routledge in 2021, entitled Experiencing the Last Judgment, focused on mosaic and painted images of the Last Judgment in Byzantine art. The breadth of Niamh's research is truly impressive, and she has also done an extensive amount of work on late antique and early Christian ivories, and this culminated in an article that she published in Art History that many of you might know. Recently, however, Niamh's turned her attention to the modern reception of Byzantine art and Byzantine architecture, and she published a book this July entitled Newman University Church, Dublin, Architectural Revivalism in the British Isles and the Authority of Form. And her talk today is rooted in that publication and is entitled Newman University Church, Dublin, Faith, Flux, and Utopian Medievalisms. Niamh, over to you.
Hello, it's a great privilege to be here this evening speaking with you all. First things first, can everyone see me over the sort of, do I have to step out of this way a little bit? It's always a challenge. Okay, so this evening's talk isn't about the Middle Ages per se, but 19th century engagement with the Middle Ages. And of course, the two things are inseparable, since our conception of the Middle Ages was so deeply shaped at that time as emergent European nations turned their gaze onto the medieval period in their search for origins and narratives of continuity. And although Jana spoke about the breadth of my research, I see it's hard for me to separate these two things in my mind. The very structures and the way we think about the Middle Ages is so sort of intertwined with reception and the mid-19th century onwards. The Middle Ages assumed increased importance at that time, and so did its study and visual and material responses to it. Revivalist movements in art and architecture developed, particularly neo-medieval efforts that spoke to the history and present identity of European nations, which often implicated religious identities in the face of rising secularism. More than a purely conservative and reactive drive, many of the resulting historicist styles that emerged in art and architecture across Europe in the 19th century can be seen as articulating a relationship to the past for present purposes. And University Church was no different in this regard, and I offer this evening an exploration of John Henry Newman and his architect John Hungerford Pollen's use of the early Christian medieval past for very present purposes, what I've termed a material advocacy for the Catholic faith in the midst of flux. In June of 1854, John Henry Newman, prominent leader of the Oxford movement and then famous convert to Roman Catholicism, was officially installed as the rector of the first Catholic university in the British Isles, the Catholic University of Ireland. The beautiful church that he built there, his first objective when he agreed to the rectorship, has been somewhat overlooked, despite the fact that it was intended as a physical embodiment of what Newman wished to achieve in and through the new university. Situated in what was then a subjugated Catholic majority region of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, its style has been treated as largely idiosyncratic, related to Newman's tastes, rather than placed properly within the context of 19th century historicisms. Its style comprised features of Roman and Byzantine basilicas in a homage to early Christian architecture broadly conceived. It wasn't purely owing to taste or to the picturesque, but rather a considered articulation that was heavily theological and responded very carefully to secularism in a manner comparable to wider European utopian uses of the early Christian and Byzantine styles in the mid-century, particularly in Bavaria, as we'll see. Indeed, the architectural and decorative choices made in Dublin were intended as a tangible manifestation of the idea behind this unprecedented Catholic university, the posing of an erudite Catholic alternative to post-Enlightenment secularism and Protestant hegemony, through a style-based analogy to the early church and its continuity through history. The style of the church formed a defense of Catholicism and heralded a statement of intent for a new social placement for Catholics, particularly those in the British Isles who were making new gains following post-Reformation persecution. Newman's church should be considered a tangible outworking of his convictions as they intersected with the exigencies of his Dublin context, in his own words, as a bodily presence for his university. Newman was born and raised in London, a member of the Church of England. He graduated from Oxford University and remained there a Fellow of Oriel College, taking on various posts as a college tutor and examiner. He was ordained an Anglican priest in 1825 and continued at the university as the vicar of St. Mary's University Church. In this role, Newman was at the forefront of the Oxford movement, the Anglo-Catholic revival, which sought to reincorporate ancient Christian traditions and ritual into the theology and liturgy of the Anglican Church. It was during his time at Oriel that Newman became increasingly drawn to the early church fathers and the patristic church. Newman began to reevaluate apostolic succession and the authority of the church through history as the guardian of the truths of Christianity. His fascination with patristics and the continuity of the church eventually caused an insurmountable tension with his Protestant faith, leading to his conversion to Roman Catholicism in 1845 and subsequent ordination as a Catholic priest in 1847, with Newman claiming, "The fathers made me Catholic." He continued to study patristics for the duration of his life, and his design for university church was intimately connected to his ecclesiology. At the end of the 1840s, Pope Pius IX had expressed a desire for a Catholic university in Ireland. 1845 had provided a catalyst when the British government had decided to establish secular, non-denominational Queen's colleges in Galway, Cork, and Belfast, responding to the problematic university question for Irish Catholics, which had persisted following the Emancipation Act of 1829. Protestant hegemony in higher education had long been contentious in Ireland. Prime Minister Robert Peel conceded the need for higher education for Irish Catholics, but government funding for a Catholic university was out of the question. The Queen's colleges were an attempt to provide a largely professional education for the emergent Irish middle classes. The Catholic University of Ireland was formally established on the 18th of May, 1854, with a Faculty of Letters or Liberal Arts, and it opened its doors at number 86 St. Stephen's Green on the 3rd of November, 1854. Newman remained in post until 1858, and then the university went into a steep decline following his departure, but what remained was eventually absorbed into the Royal University of Ireland in 1880, which was the predecessor of what is now University College Dublin. So Newman's first objective was a church that would be both a tangible representation of the university, but also a means of achieving its aims within its Irish context. He said, "It will maintain and symbolise that great principle in which we glory as our characteristic, the union of science and religion." His words resonated with the fundamental impetus for the Catholic University as outlined by the Irish Episcopate in their address to the people of Ireland, issued in support of the new university, which decried the separation, and I quote, of religion from science as one of the greatest calamities of modern times. The driving motivation behind the establishment of the university was the perfection of knowledge, which came from the union of both. Newman's church, built on his own initiative, with both practical and symbolic purposes in mind, was connected inextricably to his vision as rector, embodying his mission in Dublin. Now on to the bits that you really want to see, which is the nice parts of the church. So Newman acquired number 87 Stephen's Green beside University Church for the church, beside University House for the church in June of 1855. University Church was built in the garden to the rear of 87, accessed by means of a narrow atrium between the two houses. Pollen, whom Newman had appointed to the chair of fine arts at the university that year, was charged with drawing up plans for a basilican church, with work starting immediately. The church opened on the 1st of May, 1856. Pollen, born in London in 1820, was, like Newman, an Oxford graduate and convert to Roman Catholicism. It was Newman who decided on the overall design for the Catholic Church, with the University Gazette describing it, the inspiration, as having been furnished by those deeply impressive and historical structures, the early Italian basilicas. But Newman entrusted Pollen with the execution of his vision. The design, which Pollen based on both Roman and Byzantine basilicas, emerged from their remarkable partnership. But the church also unavoidably developed from the context of 19th century historicist styles and the accompanying discourses on aesthetics, faith, and the present day that permeated the intellectual circles that both Pollen and Newman moved in. Newman and Pollen created a simple aisleless basilica, the narrow rectangular plan determined by the garden in which it was built, terminating in a semicircular apse surmounted by a half-dome containing a pseudo-mosaic of the seated Virgin. A gallery at the back of the church and a choir gallery to the left of the sanctuary were supported by beautiful monolithic columns of variously coloured Irish marbles, which are polished limestones, with alabaster capitals, carved mostly with vegetal forms native to Ireland or generic Byzantinizing designs. The remainder of the church was sheathed in sumptuous polychromatic marble inlay, archaizing paintings related to the Nazarene movement, pseudo-mosaics of the saints, and gilded woodwork. Pollen explained the practical reasons behind the church's form over the popular Gothic revival alternative in his final lecture of his undergraduate series on the development of the basilica, delivered in Dublin in 1855 while he was designing the church. Pollen makes clear that the basilican design was determined by the limitations of the narrow site. You couldn't see the exterior, so there was no point in expending on the sculptural Gothic style, the unavailability of specialised craftsmen, and limited funds. An architecture that prioritised the interior over the exterior was less expensive and easier to execute. And Newman had financed the project personally, greatly exceeding its projected budget of $3,500 at almost $5,600. Despite Newman's anxiety over this, there were several reasons why he insisted on taking the financial burden on himself, not least the desire to be left to his own devices concerning its aesthetic. Pollen, in his Dublin lectures, very clearly situates the building as part of what he perceives as the prestigious early Christian tradition of Roman and Byzantine basilicas, envisaged as belonging to a continuum. Clearly influenced by early architectural theories, but outlining his own innovative argument, Pollen charts a clear conception of the basilica as an inherently early Christian architectural type that originated in Rome but reached perfection in Byzantine buildings, with those of Ravenna being held up as superior. In his later writings on the structural characteristics of the basilica, Pollen says the same spirit seems to have reigned over the architecture of these first 8 or 9 centuries of our era, and basilicas, whether Byzantine or Roman, were of common origin, the monuments of old empire. For Pollen and Newman, this, and I quote, serious and imposing style of architecture, end quote, perfected in the basilican tradition, spoke to the history of Christianity's triumph as a newly imperial religion, when the church transitioned from being a persecuted minority worshipping in houses to worshipping in large new buildings. To express the essence of Ireland's unprecedented Catholic university, Newman and Pollen created a church that generated an analogy with the triumph and continuity of the early church. And analogies between the church of the present and past are found throughout Newman's substantial corpus of writings. In his famous sermon, The Second Spring, which he preached in celebration of the restoration of hierarchy in England, the re-establishment of the Catholic diocesan structure in 1850, following its dissolution at the Reformation, Newman compared Catholics and their survival in post-Reformation England to the early persecuted church, saying such were Catholics in England, found in corners and alleys and cellars and the housetops or in the recesses of the country, cut off from the populous world around them and dimly seen, as if through a mist or in twilight, as ghosts flitting to and fro by the high Protestants, the lords of the earth. He went on to herald the restoration of the Catholic Church in England, and he harboured a comparable optimism concerning what might be achieved for Catholics by means of the university. Writing later, Pollen succinctly articulated how the architectural form of the Dublin Church expressed the essence of Newman's vision, saying he felt a strong attachment to those ancient churches with rude exteriors, but solemn and impressive within, recalling the early history of the church as it gradually felt its way into the converted empire and took possession. The nascent Catholic university operated not only in the face of a hegemonic Protestant socio-political hierarchy, but also within a post-Enlightenment intellectual climate grappling with secularism. In Newman's memorandum for the Synod of April 1854, he stated that one of the university's central objectives was to provide a series of sound and philosophical defences of Catholicity and revelation in answer to the infidel tenets and arguments which threaten us at this time. The architecture and its decoration spoke to both Protestantism and secularism through an appeal to the early church, which successfully overcame the perceived analogous pagan majority context within which it was born and continued into the Middle Ages. the creation of a beautiful and imposing edifice that channeled the early church to meet the needs of a modern university, expressed Newman's vision for the university, which would embody the perfect union of science and religion and devote itself holistically to the intellectual formation of its students, turning out erudite Catholic men who would take up societal roles hitherto denied to them. The motivation then behind Newman's choice of the basilica resonated with the meaning attributed to them in some of the first English architectural histories of the 19th century, as a type embodying the rise and triumph of Christianity, since Emperor Constantine began converting these pagan civic buildings to Christian usage following the Edict of Milan. Edward Freeman, in his influential First History of Architecture published in English, develops this concept most fully, saying that the appropriation of this imperial building type for Christian use embodied the fundamental shift that had occurred, which did not merely account to the displacement of one religion by another, but rather the triumph of religion over all spheres of life. The basilica spoke to the seating of God on the throne of this world's power, the judgment seat of Caesar. For Freeman, the basilica had an immediacy of message. The mention of these buildings at once bring before us the first triumphs of our religion, its structural parts, a tangible manifestation of the spoils of Christianity's enemies, from the splendors of her long-drawn nave to her mighty apse. Many writers distinguished between Basilican and Byzantine traditions, the latter differentiated chiefly by means of the dome. Freeman perceived the Basilica and Byzantine traditions as two important starting points from which almost all subsequent forms may be derived. Their influence runs in two streams, sometimes remaining parallel and distinct, sometimes converging and commingling, with their profitable commingling resulting in some of the most successful medieval buildings of Italy and Germany, particularly the basilicas of Ravenna. Despite the distinction between the two traditions in such histories, which increased as time went on with greater exposure to Byzantine buildings in Greece, the Basilican and Byzantine were not so easily disentangled in perception or practice, reflected in the fact that 19th century revivals of these styles often emerged symbiotically. Pollen charted clearly in his Dublin lectures and later journal article of 1858 a clear conception of the continuity of structure and form between Roman basilicas and Byzantine buildings, and he saw his Dublin church as part of this tradition. Pollen anticipated criticisms of his inclusion of both what he termed the basilica proper and more centralized domed churches under one category, and indeed a positively scathing review of Pollen's article appeared in The Ecclesiologist in 1858, wherein the reviewer refuted Pollen's evolutionary trajectory. Pollen was resolute that the principles and spirit shared by the buildings merited his decision to trace this connection between Roman and Byzantine iterations of the most serious and imposing tradition of architecture, which defined the first 9 centuries of Christianity. Nonetheless, the aisleless basilica necessitated an interior form of architecture that privileged colour, texture, and symbolic pictorial representation. And symbolism and affectivity and associated forays into the use of colour had increased in Victorian ecclesiastical design from the 1830s onwards, as church buildings became imbricated in the defence of the Christian faith and points of doctrine in the face of growing secularism and denominational disputes. Both structurally, to the choice and arrangement of construction materials, colour was incorporated, and by means of the application of tiles, painting, stained glass, and eventually mosaic, although not without contention, because colour, sensuousness, papism, and Orientalism continued to be conflated in various permutations for many, despite increasing advocacy amongst Gothic revivalists for the use of polychrome. Pollen asserted that the builders of basilicas had no intention of challenging critics of their exteriors. They contemplated art in their interior only, this by a means of a system of decorative incrustation, and here he's referencing Ruskin's primary characteristic with which he defined Byzantine architecture, its confessed incrustation, the sheathing of inexpensive structural mediums such as brick with precious marbles and mosaics. Pollen asserted that the basilica was the most appropriate structure for persuasively displaying the beautiful Irish marbles, which were the greatest cost incurred by the project, connecting University Church meaningfully to its Irish context. Pollen said, naturally too, in an institution like ours, yet in a state of infancy, and designed to draw out and deepen the heart and intelligence of the nation, we wish to set the example of developing, as far as resources went, the natural capabilities of Ireland, and geologically the most valuable of these are the various veins of marble so plentifully compacted under and over the soil on every coast and in every county. All these requirements and more were better to be fulfilled in a basilica than any other kind of building. The dark antechapel dramatically frames the bright, colourful space of the nave. A row of 8 thin monolithic columns of alternating black and brown shafts support the gallery above, surmounted by carved alabaster capitals featuring Irish flora, such as oak leaves and clover. Tall elliptical arches frame the view towards the apse. Now, Roman columns springing into a round arched arcade were considered a defining characteristic of both early Christian and Byzantine architecture by Victorian writers, but arcades based on a stilted or elliptical arch were perceived as being specifically Byzantine over the semicircular. So for Freeman, it was the stilted arch that differentiated the Byzantine from the basilican style. Preceding this row are 4 thicker freestanding columns. Their alabaster capitals comprise more sharply stylized foliage, more so in the Byzantine manner, similar to some capitals in San Vitale and Ravenna. They also resemble Ruskin's diagrams of various Byzantine convex or cushion capitals in the Stones of Venice, which was published immediately before the church was built. Clearly drawing on Ruskin's ideas, and he does so throughout his writings, Pollen describes the convex Byzantine cushion capital as having been based on the concave acanthus leaf capital of classical antiquity, differentiated from it by a greater desire to appreciate its natural beauty, and with a certain delight in observing the fresh joyousness of living vegetation blown by winds and clinging around the convex mass. Following the decline of the classical tradition, Pollen saw, and I quote, the Easterns as far exceeding the West in the design of the capital, and thus Byzantine churches as the best field for study of the capital. He celebrates the capitals of Ravenna and Constantinople in particular as having an original character of their own, which was sharp, severely controlled, but not wanting in vigor or grace. 3 registers of colourful marble inlay, the defining feature of the basilica in Pollen's mind, cover the walls of the nave up to a height of 15 feet. The applied panels brought the strata of the Irish landscape into the church, and the technique of their execution imbued them with a deeper symbolic significance still. Pollen continued, the side walls are crusted over with marbles in the peculiar mode called by the ancients opus musivum. No raised panellings as in the Gothic or modern Italian methods, only flat intarsiature without relief. This inlaid marble is bordered and incorporated into the wall by a string or running mould in the Byzantine manner of Caen stone, roughed over with flat lines and covered with gold. The 1856 description of University Church in the Catholic University Gazette by Newman said, "To Irish productions we shall be indebted for a variety of colour and vein, which might almost vie with St. Mark's at Venice, that mine of the most precious relics of antiquity. Style, technique, and apostolic lineage were inseparable." A simulation of the arcaded aisle design of basilicas is achieved through the articulation of the lower register of each nave wall with 5 inlaid shafts of Galway green, which have a sort of a very rich vertical grain that give the illusion of columns. A thin black surround outlines these faux columns, their alabaster plinths and their relief alabaster capitals, making them to appear to project outwards from the wall. And they subdivide the nave walls into 12 rectangular sections populated with duller rectangular reds and browns, arranged in a grid of black, which strikes a balance between emulating the shaded aisle space of early basilicas, and producing a rich decorative effect, declaring the integrity of the wall surface. Each arch of the pseudo-arcade frames a golden lunette painted by Pollen himself, probably on roughened slate. The textured gold ground of each painting creates a play of light, and the inclusion of hatched lines and pieces of coloured glass and polished marble conspires to imitate mosaic tesserae. The style clearly resonates with the work of pre-Raphaelite painters to whom Pollen was connected, and the desire to respond to late medieval painting styles. At the centre of each lunette is a standing figure of a saint, each carefully chosen for their significance to Ireland, like St. Patrick and St. Bridget, to Dublin, St. Lawrence, to Rome, Peter and Paul, and to education, perhaps most fittingly Thomas Aquinas, the father of scientific theology and instructor at the University of Paris. The gold-painted woodwork of the choir gallery screen emulates gilded latticework. Pollen said, "I introduced something after the old Byzantine manner, pierced lattice in place of curtains in the singer's gallery, and pierced work in the baldacchino of the altar and pulpit." For Pollen, the basilica and colour were inextricably connected, and he attributed the lack of interest in the basilica in his day to an inability to master polychromy. Indeed, his main criticism of contemporary Gothic was the relative absence of colour, which he saw as inculcating effect and bringing perfection to form. It's clear in his writings that light and the colourful effect of the whole, which he perceived as a melody, were determinative in terms of his design process in Dublin, and he attributed his finely tuned considerations of colour and light to having travelled to the definitive Christian basilicas in person. In a letter to Newman, Pollen explained, "Colour is the one element which cannot be done but by an experienced eye. The slightest change in any tint is to destroy the whole. It's like altering a note in music." He carefully planned the positioning of the windows even, so as to give the whole of the wall decorations the best possible chance of showing themselves without excessive light or shade, every aspect harmonised with the whole. So aside from Newman's instruction, Ruskin's influence, and Pollen's first-hand experiences of churches in Italy and Constantinople, the design was also shaped by the modern Rundbogenstil, or round arch style buildings that both he and Newman had visited in Munich, some of which similarly combined Basilican and Byzantine traditions in various permutations, drawing upon colour, surface, and the pictorial for comparable reasons. The eclectic round-arched revival buildings of Munich were lauded in English publications, and Pollen and Newman visited there separately in 1847, when students and antiquarians were flocking to study the architecture and related revivalist mural paintings of the Nazarenes, that King Ludwig I had brought from Rome. Pollen was greatly interested in Leo von Klenze's gold-clad All Saints Church, inspired by the Cappella Palatina in Sicily, even though it didn't end up looking like it. But he was particularly interested in George Friedrich Siebland's Basilica of St. Boniface, which was destroyed in the Second World War, but which was under construction when Pollen was there. Replete with monolithic marble columns, a brightly painted timber roof, and murals by Henrik von Hesse, including religious history scenes over the arcade and a Byzantinizing pseudo-mosaic in the apse. This imitation 6th century basilica, which was very clearly inspired by San Apollinare in Classe and San Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, became a definitive exemplar of the early Christian Rundbogenstil. And Ludwig had founded the Benedictine abbey to which the church belonged as part of his efforts to reinvigorate the Catholic faith in Munich after the secularism of the early 19th century. And he gave the community there jurisdiction over the nearby museum district to demonstrate the intersection of religion and the arts and sciences as part of his resistance and reinvigoration of a Catholic society. Pollen saw that St. Boniface in particular held importance for contemporary design, and it clearly exerted an influence in Dublin, along with its prototypes in Ravenna. But Pollen was really weary of medieval plagiarisms in relation to the Munich designs, and his church was intended as response in the truest sense rather than imitation. The original paintings that hung above the marble inlay on the nave walls formed part of the careful and colourful expression of continuity from the early church, and they were modelled on Raphael's tapestries representing events from the lives of Peter and Paul and the death of the proto-martyr Stephen. The tapestries commissioned by Pope Leo X in 1515 for the Sistine Chapel. And these copies were punctuated by copies of the paintings of the 12 apostles from the nave pillars in the Abbey Church of Tre Fontane in Rome, thought at the time to be the work of Raphael or his school, and of a similar date to the tapestries. So what you're looking at, apart from the darkened image, are replacements. The paintings deteriorated considerably over time, and despite numerous attempts to restore them, they were replaced with these bright acrylic paintings by Levin Tunzer at the beginning of the 21st century. And my hunch is that Pollen would not have been happy with them. From the early 1800s, interest grew in archaic or primitive Christian works of art predating the High Renaissance as part of the drive to reinvigorate Christian spirituality. Attentiveness to these purer artworks manifested prominently in the formation of groups such as the Brotherhood of St. Luke, derogatively termed the Nazarenes by those who mocked their appearance and medievalizing lifestyle, the group of German Romantic painters who drew inspiration from medieval and early Renaissance religious art. The Brotherhood were at their height in Rome after 1812, when Peter Cornelius joined Johann Friedrich Overbeck in leading the movement there. Cornelius was then brought to Munich in the 1820s by Ludwig I, where he played a decisive role in the reinvigoration of mural painting. There was great interest in the Nazarenes in England. Newman had even shown interest prior to conversion, and while he was in Rome in 1847, he met Overbeck and then travelled with the Nazarene painter Heinrich von Hesse to Munich on his journey home, where he admired, in his own words, the celebrated frescoes, commenting that those by Hesse, who had painted All Saints and St. Boniface, were the most beautiful. Newman then personally commissioned the Dublin paintings while on a visit to Rome, writing to Pollen on the 1st of February 1856 that he had an arrangement with one M. Platner, a disciple of the Nazarenes, and that they had engaged a French painter to complete the paintings. In 1847, Nicholas Wiseman, who went on to become the first Catholic Archbishop of Westminster in 1850, wrote a rallying call in the Dublin Review for, in his own words, a school of English religious art modelled on movements like the Nazarenes, which took their leave from Quattrocento masters like the blessed Fra Angelico. Wiseman laid a challenge related to his desire for a Catholic school of painting in England. He was critical of Pugin's revival of Gothic churches for Catholics, asking, what chance is there for Christian painting in a church which has not yet raised fitting walls on which it can be executed? Newman seemingly rose to the challenge in his creation of a flat-walled basilica adorned with archaizing history paintings, fulfilling in part Wiseman's wish that Catholics would show the public what good Christian painting was, just, in his own words, just as the King of Bavaria had done at Munich. Wiseman had posed the challenge to the Catholic Church in the British Isles, saying, let us throw open one good church glowing from its ceiling to its lower panelling, to show that such forms of beauty and the desire for better things in terms of Catholic aesthetics belonged not to the past but to the present and future. And it was Newman who took up the gauntlet and this utopian aesthetic. Like the basilican design, marbles and gilded woodwork, the paintings continued the visual appeal to the apostolic authority of Rome through history. Their appeal to early Italian masters and to subjects pertaining to the early history of the church was intended, according to Pollen, to create an analogy between the work of the university and the activities of the early church and between their contexts. He said to Newman, I hope you will like the choice for university church, as we mean to smash modern heathenism under the communion and in the name of Peter. The church appealed to the early church at every turn, and it was unavoidably intersecting, whether directly or indirectly, with the thought of Edward Gibbon. University church inherently undermined theories of rupture, atrophy, and decline through an expression of early and medieval Christianity adapted to present needs. The church's design should be seen as having been chosen not only to create an analogy with the triumph of the early church, but to express sacred continuity and the development of the Catholic Church over the centuries, which served to justify the mission of the university. This use of forms to express the essence of Newman's post-Enlightenment Catholic university was unavoidably a challenge to Gibbon's influence and his scathing deprecation of the early medieval church in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, particularly as it worked itself out in the writings of Protestant scholars who repudiated the continued authority of Rome. Characterizations of the corruption of the medieval Catholic Church, closely informed by Gibbon's work in which he detailed the triumph of barbarism and religion, were used by Protestants to undermine the present authority of Rome. Writing about the persecution faced by English Catholics because of Protestantism, Newman discussed the foundational notion upon which the rejection of Catholicism and their mistreatment rested in his eyes. The idea that Christianity was very pure in its beginning, was very corrupt in the Middle Age, and is very pure in England now, though still corrupt everywhere else. That in the Middle Age, a tyrannical institution called the Church arose and swallowed up Christianity, and that church is still alive and has not yet disgorged its prey In the Middle Age, there was no Christianity anywhere at all, but all was dark and horrible and as bad as paganism, or rather, much worse. For Newman, Protestantism had ditched, in his words, 1,000 years from the world's chronicle, resulting in, again in Newman's words, its want of past history and its want of fixed teaching. Indeed, in an essay on the development of doctrine from 1845, published in the year of his conversion, Newman decried the utter incongruity between Protestantism and historical Christianity as being plain fact, arguing that historical continuity belonged to Catholics. For Newman, Protestant disavowal of the medieval church led to a most unfortunate lack of scholarship in England on ecclesiastical history, to the point where the only English writer who had any claim to be considered an ecclesiastical historian is the unbeliever Gibbon. Despite Newman's respect for Gibbon, and he had a sort of a very complex sort of fascination with Gibbon in some ways, which I can't go into today, his characterization of the deficiencies of the early medieval church provided a fitting model for Protestants concerned to demarcate when the church ceased to be pure and became corrupt, marking the point of rupture between true Christianity and its debased medieval Catholic form. It was Newman's eventual rejection of this model that precipitated his conversion, a conviction that he articulated in full in the development of doctrine, which demonstrated how key elements of belief had evolved over time whilst maintaining their essence and integrity without the church ever contradicting her own enunciations. This was Newman's influential and still influential accretive understanding of doctrine. History, particularly the history of the early and medieval church, was integral to Catholic identity, and proving consistency and sacred continuity while allowing for change, the cogency of a dynamically evolving religious tradition, from the early church through the Middle Ages to the church of the 19th century was key to Newman's defence of Catholicity and revelation, which was one of his main objectives for the university. For Newman, to be Catholic was to accept that the truths of Christianity had evolved through history under the guardianship of Rome. Newman's contention was that the established Protestant church in England had embraced the truth that contemporary Catholicism was not a pure descendant of the early church, but rather a corrupted offshoot. So correspondingly, his implicit objective in both development of doctrine and university church was to emphasize sacred continuity and refute notions of rupture. Now, Newman was very aware of what was happening across Europe, saying that the revival of an almost forgotten architecture, which is at present taking place in our own countries, in France and in Germany, may in some way or other run away with us into this or that era unless we keep a watch over its course. Newman was very aware that he was building in the context of a revivalism variously connected to doctrinal matters and issues of nationalism, and that his buildings would be read by others. But he was really remarkably consistent that architecture should develop in the same way as doctrine and respond to its context, providing what he termed a living architecture of the 19th century suited to hosting the living ritual of the church. Appeals to the past were only valued for their contribution to the present. And so his Dublin church became an embodiment, really, of his accretive understanding of the Catholic faith as a contemporary expression of an ancient basilica, the preservation and evolution of a type, a rich palimpsest of Christian tradition, each layer a physical outworking of Newman's understanding of Christian revelation. Whilst for others, medieval revivalism was often imbricated in emergent nationalisms, Newman was only interested in Catholic identity. The church projected an erudite and time-honoured identity for disenfranchised Catholics, an embodiment of the university's mission to restore persecuted Catholics to their rightful societal positions denied them. In his lectures delivered before the university's inauguration, Newman said, "Catholics in these islands have not been in a condition for centuries to attempt the sort of education which is necessary for the man of the world, the statesman, the landholder, or the opulent gentleman. Their legitimate stations, duties, employments have been taken from them." The structure, forms, and Irish materials were used to create something that connected back to the ancient church, but which was entirely new in its impetus, built for 19th century needs. Newman and Pollen's vision was for a better Catholic future, and their church provided a physical manifestation of those utopian aspirations. Nowhere is the connection between the church's aesthetic and the mission of the university more evident than in the pseudo-mosaic painted by Newman on the lined wooden panels in the apse, and I'll finish with this evening. It formed the centerpiece of the church, both visually and conceptually. In the center, the enthroned Virgin is labeled as the seat of wisdom. An inhabited vine grows from the base of the composition, its branches swirling outwards in a series of circles that occupy the remaining space of the conch. Each circle contains a saint bearing a palm frond. A variety of flora and fauna occupy the tendrils. Now, the design was clearly a response to the 12th century apse mosaic in the upper church of San Clemente in Rome, itself comprising significant early Christian and medieval motifs, connecting the building once again to the ancient and medieval Church of Rome. Moreover, the design can be read as an exposition of Newman's philosophy of education. The San Clemente mosaic was perceived as a Byzantine work of art in the 19th century and connected two ideas of Christian revival. Influential antiquarian Lord Lindsay even went so far as to say that the first stirrings of the revival of art under the 11th century Byzantine Komnenian emperors was first felt in the mosaic of San Clemente, which embodied the resuscitation of the symbolism of early Christianity. Mosaic was identified at this time with the revival of art under Christianity generally, and Pollen too attributed these so-called rude Byzantine designs to the revival of arts after the disintegration of empire. The seat of wisdom is the part of the composition that deviates most obviously from the design at San Clemente, and she's key to understanding the meaning of the church as a whole. Newman's opinions on education are peppered across his vast corpus of writings. Particularly important in this regard is the idea of a university, enshrined now as a classic text on third-level education. Originally, though, it was a collection of lectures setting Newman's vision for a liberal education at Ireland's first Catholic university. The first set were delivered in 1852 in advance of the opening, and the second were occasional lectures delivered while he was rector. In sketching the essence of a university in relation to his Irish context, the lectures give insight into the issues he perceived as most pressing in setting up the university. Those written before the university opened primarily addressed the need for the Catholic university as opposed to the secular Queen's colleges, and his educational vision was inescapably responding to the Oxbridge model and the debate concerning utilitarianism in education that burgeoned at this time. Newman outlines a broad, holistic approach to pedagogy and the person, which didn't prioritize specific skills, but rather valuable thinking members of society. The end goal of a university was not the advancement of knowledge per se, but rather equipping students with an intellect properly trained and formed to have a connected view or grasp of things. A liberal education could, as such, be an end in and of itself, but it necessarily came with great secular utility, constituting the best and highest formation of the intellect for social and political life. A fully formed, cultivated intellect, or what Newman termed a philosophical habit of mind, which could holistically synthesize and integrate all spheres of knowledge, could only be acquired by means of a complete curriculum that embraced all of the sciences, including theology. In response to the so-called godless colleges of Robert Peel, which proposed not to teach religion at all in a co-educational context, Newman emphasized the place of theology in the curriculum. You're going to have to bear with me to get to why it connects to the apse. So after the church opened, Newman's first sermon fortuitously took place on the feast of St. Monica, mother of St. Augustine, the most erudite theologian of the early church. It was Monica's relentless prayers that were realized in the conversion of her son. Prior to conversion, Augustine had pursued the growth of his intellect for his own ambitions, and this is all in keeping with Newman's thought, but then he put it to the service of the church. Monica became a model for the church, and Augustine for intelligence harnessed for greater needs. And so Newman, took full advantage of the opportunity and made the analogy between the mother and the university as the alma mater, who took her place in the lives of the young people entrusted to her care, who would turn out her charges as both oracles of philosophy and shrines of devotion through uniting science with religion. Newman described the university as both the alma mater and also as the seat of learning across his Dublin lectures. And the words "seat of wisdom, pray for us" appeared across university materials and its seal. The Virgin in the apse provided a type for the university as the alma mater in inculcating wisdom, the holistic acquisition of intellectual knowledge utilized with diligence as her charges were sent into the world. The idea radiated from the apse and is found in small but significant details throughout the church, particularly the relief alabaster capitals that complete the pseudo-columns of the nave, on which a series of mother birds incubate and feed their chicks, generating a further analogy between the university and the mother. Structuring the natural world, supporting the seat of wisdom, and containing the saints that look towards her is the vine, the most overt borrowing from San Clemente, where the motif is interpreted through the Latin inscription at the base of the composition as a representation of the church. We liken the church of Christ to this vine. Knowledge alone could not produce virtue. Philosophy did not give one command over the passions. Teaching theology as a branch necessary to universal knowledge did not make a university Catholic. For Newman, and I quote, a direct and active jurisdiction of the church over it, end quote, was necessary for this. The university was supported, mandated and nourished by the church in turning out erudite Catholic students of the highest caliber, honed intellectually, morally and spiritually, a church whose authority stretched back to the early Christian period. This idea was manifested potently in the pseudo-mosaic through its iconography of the alma mater supported by the vine. The concept was supported materially and visually through the emulation of the inherently early Christian medium of mosaic. And it was no coincidence that Pollen referenced this mosaic in particular to make this point, since San Clemente had been occupied by Irish Dominicans since 1667, bolstering once more the connection of the Irish Catholic Church to Rome. So after the Enlightenment, the march of secularism and the attendant debates concerning the appropriateness of marrying education and religion, the Catholic University was to provide unity to the different branches of knowledge as part of a liberal education that would cultivate intellect and faith in turning out societal leaders. And Pollen's image comprised a succinct expression of Newman's idea of a university. His vision for an education that pitted itself against pure utilitarianism was expressed most magnificently through the pseudo-mosaic, which made clear that the full authority of Rome, founded upon continuity from the early church, stood behind the university and its mission.
Thank you, Niamh. That was really, really fascinating. I'm going to open the floor up to questions.
Thank you, Niamh. Was this church influential on J.F. Bentley and his building at Westminster Cathedral?
So that's a really interesting question, and one that I sort of delve into a little bit in the last sort of chapter of the book that this research has come from, because this is like half a century earlier, and all of the writing just kind of talks about Westminster as if it comes from nowhere. But actually, there are links, and Pollen did advise some of the sort of the people. You know, Westminster is quite a complex building with lots of different people involved at different stages. Pollen did advise somewhat, but there does seem to have been quite, I would say, a sort of an unawareness, actually, if you look at the sort of the writings at the time, particularly like in the Builder and different sort of journals, a kind of a lack of awareness of what had happened in Dublin, which is probably reflective of the status of Ireland in that period.
Thanks, Niamh. I really enjoyed that, and lots of food for thought. One thing that I wondered is, Newman being a convert to Catholicism, how did, it might be unanswerable, how did members of old Catholic families respond to it? Sort of the old recusant families, the old Irish, Anglo-Irish elites.
So I mean, that kind of touches on, the Irish kind of context is mostly, quite impoverished at that time. But there's a really complex sort of situation there with the Irish bishops. And so Cullen, who I didn't speak about, he, was the sort of the person behind this, the Archbishop behind it. And he brings Newman over. He's hoping that this very well-known, influential Oxford convert will give some sort of authority to the university. And Newman is very aware that he's operating in a context that he doesn't fully understand, and that there's a lot of reticence. And in the book, I talk about how he's chosen this style so that it doesn't too closely emulate Rome. It's like it's referring to Rome, but kind of old Rome rather than contemporary Rome, because there's a lot of suspicions about not sort of exciting feelings about too much papal interference in Ireland. So I think he receives basically a very mixed reception as he moves around Ireland when he first comes around. A lot of people are happy to have him there, but other people are sort of suspicious, and they think they should go with the secular Queen's colleges because they don't want direct papal interference. So it's a very complex kind of situation.
And did the design of the interior extend also to altar furnishings and the vestments, or?
Pollen's design.
Oh no, I was just wondering, the sacred silver, and was that in an early Christian style?
He speaks about. I don't know exactly what was in the space at that time, but he speaks about wanting everything hot from Rome. So he wants everything to sort of bring about. He's an Oratarian. Like, I haven't had a time to speak about everything that has sort of influenced Newman, but he belongs to the oratory, and so he has very sort of careful considerations of how music and all of the vestments and everything should form part of this kind of almost experience of heaven on earth, which is very Byzantine.
Presumably, sorry.
Okay, I think they're coming to you next. Sorry.
Sorry, do you mind just...
Yes, lovely. The first church that he produced when he was an Anglican was very plain, little more, but that's not really my question. There is a church in Oxford which is, although the decoration is incomplete, it's an Anglican church, St. Barnabas, and which actually has very similar aesthetic, and I wonder how that comes into this into the general story of this sort of revival of an early Christian aesthetic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and so it's that book, that church is in the book as well. I do look ahead to the sort of the later, as the sort of Byzantine revival takes off, the early, but it's as you're completely correct. It's sort of intersected with sort of early Christian ideas as well, and so I do compare it because it's quite similar in conception. And interestingly, when they were building that church, that's one of the times where you can see that they're very unaware of what's happened in Dublin, because they're celebrating this being the first basilica created on these shores, and they're quite unaware of what's happened in Dublin. And I think, although little more is discussed in the book as well, and his design for his oratory church in Birmingham, which never came to fruition, because you can see Newman's sort of his development as he kind of wrestles with an aesthetic faith and what that means as he converts, and then is kind of freed from some of that torment. There's an interesting article on how he responded to the catacombs in Rome. He's very much on a journey, but actually a lot of things are still comparable. He still has practical purposes in mind for all of his churches. It was very important for him for acoustics, for music, for preaching, and that kind of symbolic. There are sort of aspects of Littlemore which are quite sacramental in terms of his understanding of the lancet windows, and you can see him developing, and I feel like Newman University Church is him at full fruition in terms of what the physical church can do for one's faith, but it's always in service to faith. He's quite wary of revivalist movements. Thank you.
Presumably the alabaster that was used for the capitals was English alabaster, and I'm wondering why Pollen didn't use Irish marble.
He does source some things from England, the alabaster spars. There's sort of a few things that he gets from England, but mostly the marbles are from Ireland. And I think he goes around sort of sourcing things, and it's really interesting when you read his letters to Newman. He's really looking for the best colours and the best sort of effect. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's to do with cost as well.
The alabaster looks like the sort of Staffordshire, not highest grade by English reckoning,
They were on a budget, yeah.
A lot of iron in it. But, yeah, well, perhaps that was the issue.
It's actually to sort of pick up on the granites and the marbles that are being used there. And the Oxford University Museum was sort of begun just before this, and also uses granites and marbles as sort of demonstration pieces, including some material from Irish, and is the result actually of an Irish architectural practice. And I was wondering if there's any sort of consciousness of that in the use of materials.
Yeah, so again, I didn't have time to talk about everything, but this building is very much connected to the museum building, which has gone up before it in Dublin, which is connected into those sort of circles. And the museum building is more impressive in terms of its materials and carvings. And Pollen's very good friends with the architect. And he goes on to work in Oxford with, his name has completely gone out of my head, if anyone can remember. I'm drawing a complete blank. But yeah, it's very much connected, and there's huge debates at this time about, obviously this is the moment of sort of industry is making possible all the mining of the sort of excavating of these materials, but the Irish materials are getting quite a lot of attention in Britain at that time in sort of architectural journals as being, actually there's more variety, they're better quality, and they're being displayed at these sort of industry fairs. So, yeah, I think there definitely is a connection between England and Ireland in that regard.
Might I ask a supplementary question as well about aisles and aisle-lessness? And I realise, obviously, you have a source to say that a church ought to be sort of painted from floor to ceiling. But was there ever any discussion about aisles or the lack of them prior to the decision, actually? Or is it sort of partly the dictation of the site?
I haven't read anything specifically between Newman and Pollen in relation to that, but if I was to hazard a guess, I would say it's because Newman basically, what he said he wants is almost a barn, because he doesn't want anything impeding the view of the altar, which he's very obviously critical of Pujan in that regard. And, you know, he wants perfect visibility, perfect acoustics, and I would say he basically wanted as big a site as big a church as the narrow site would permit, and full sort of visibility. So I think I think the aisles are an interesting thing, though, that simulation, because that's where Pollen really departs from Ruskin. So there's a lot of debate at that time over the role of cladding, the role of polychromy. And so while some sort of the Gothic revivalists will allow for structural polychromy that is still sort of truthful to the structure of the building, you know, Ruskin will allow for cladding, and he's obviously loves the sort of buildings of Venice, but it shouldn't disguise the true form of the building, whereas Pollen is actively playing with, he's creating a simulation, and he's very clearly departed from sort of contemporary thinking. He's quite innovative in the way he sees things. He's very clearly drawing on Ruskin's ideas a lot of the time, but then he's completely playing with this in relation to those aisles.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Can I? I'm talking through my hat here a bit, but it's Pujan's Church of St. James at Reading is 1840s, isn't it? And does play with sort of rather Roman basilical design, I think. And I wondered how that sort of fitted in with this. What was also fascinating were those German buildings that are so Roman and so early, I suppose, sort of doing this, and the influence of Nazarenes. George Eliot was very interested in them, and they feature largely in Middlemarch, don't they? Mm-hmm. And I just wondered did he bring over Nazarene artists from Italy or from Germany for his paintings here?
Newman, no. So he employs two French artists in the end, who are from the kind of the circle. The person who has organized it is a Nazarene disciple. there's a whole sort of interesting background there as well. But basically, these circles that are still influential, although a lot of them have departed from Rome at the time that Newman is there. They're thought still very influential, and it's all to do with sort of reinvigorating Christian spirituality through archaizing styles. So he employs these French painters. Again, obviously, budget is a huge consideration in everything he's doing, and he has them painted and then shipped over and then hung. And so I think it's hard to kind of see I should have included a whole view of the church at the end. The original sort of melody that Pollen created, he was even a little bit kind of hesitant as to whether the colours of those kind of more modern paintings would kind of fit with the colours that he had so carefully orchestrated. But Newman was really resolute that he wanted Nazarene-style paintings in the church. So you can see that sort of dialogue.
Do we know what the artists had been working on in France?
No, we know very little. And there's been a little bit of work by an Irish art historian kind of guessing. We just get sort of surnames, and one of them I think probably has a misspelling of the name. So there's an Irish art historian who's tried to connect to specific French painters, but we can't be sure. But general sort of, the painters that she identifies are generally sort of Christian, archaizing, religious kind of history painters in keeping with the kind of the Nazarene ethos.
Thank you.
Just a quick question about the relationship with John Ruskin and the Stones of Venice, as Ruskin was very keen to sort of demonstrate that the decoration, the sheathing of St. Mark's or other Byzantine buildings was honest, and that it was declared through the use of bronze clips. But I noticed that there's no such use of any, in inverted commas, honest revelation, sort of fixings in this building. Do you think that that was a sort of a theoretical decision, or do you think it was perhaps more just in terms of economy?
Well, I think so. That exactly relates to the Isles issue that I was talking about. That he very clearly departs from Ruskin's assertion that it should be honest. And he's very actively playing with that in relation to this creation of a sort of an illusion, essentially. But then he does declare the wall surface as well through the grid lines, so he kind of pulls back from it in the end a little bit, somewhat. In terms of the only sort of indication we have of what his inspiration was is from that quote I included about the sort of the Opus Museum, which he refers to it as a sort of a mosaic work. And he's seen this in the buildings of Ravenna and Rome, and so he's copying sort of earlier work that he's seen, I think in San Vitale probably. So yes, he doesn't stay with Ruskin on everything. You can see Ruskin's thought like kind of throughout his work, but he's very Pollen's an interesting character. He goes his own way as well. Even in terms of that continuum of early Christian architecture over 9 centuries and the way he perceives of the Basilica and the Byzantine. He's an interesting thinker, and I think not really given enough credit.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was just curious if there's any intersection between this building and the ideas behind it and Irish nationalism at this point in time, or because there are mentions of the Byzantine Empire and and I wonder if there's questions of empire either in kind of supporting Ireland's part of the British Empire, or does it find itself flying the flag, as it were, of a kind of Irish independence? Is there anything to suggest that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think Newman, in a sense, knew in relation to those questions, he was a little bit kind of out of his depth. And I think there's a complex body of scholarship in terms of Newman and the university, and it didn't actually do very well as a university. Parts of it did. The medical school continued on. Ironically, since that was the most sort of practical of the schools. And he never managed to found the theological department because he left it to the bishops. But it's this difficulties with the kind of the Irish ecclesiastical landscape and political landscape. He kind of references it throughout his work, throughout his letters, and he kind of acknowledges that he's not able to fully understand, you know, the issues that present themselves in relation to the complex Irish context. And a lot of the issues he's running into are because of those very things. He can't be seen to be. He wants to bring in, say, onto the University Finance Committee, he wants to bring Irish people in and try to kind of, work more closely with those who might be more nationalistic in sentiment. But he knows he's going to cause problems, he's going to annoy people and, you know, all of this. So he's treading carefully, and I think a lot of people would see it that he wasn't sufficiently prepared to deal with the complexities of the context that he was working in. And he wants to, in terms of empire and sort of nationalism, his view is not that the university is not just for Irish Catholics. He wants it to be, there's no Catholic university in England either. He wants this to be for Catholics from across the British Isles, but also beyond. He talks about it being for all those where English is the language that's spoken. So he has this very utopian idea that this is going to be, the beginnings of greater things in terms of education for Catholics. And he's trying to, I think, go past, rise above the sort of complexities of the context, but it's not possible.
Right, I think if there are no other pressing questions, then I'll wrap this up. Thank you all for such interesting questions. And Niamh, thank you for such a fascinating talk. I think we all learned a huge amount. Thank you.